Thank you for the opportunity to present to you all today. In your packets, you'll have a couple-page document where I've summarized my findings when looking at our mid-year performance in terms of revenue and expenses. It's through June 30th, 2020, and I compare it both to the budget as well as to 2019 performance, trying to compare and see how how we're doing and how we've been impacted. This year has been unusual with COVID-19, so we've seen a lot of areas where we haven't met our expectations in both the revenue as well as in expenses. So I'll dive right into it. I'm going to start by going over our revenue, and I'll go through each fund. More time will be spent on the general fund, as we have a lot more services within that fund, and we rely heavily on taxpayer dollars as well as program revenue fees. As you look through this report, I have indicators throughout where I'll say, we're meeting expectations either compared to the budget, or we're meeting or failing expectations compared to where we were last year. The general fund right now is operating below expectations. Overall, we're about $300,000 less. But looking through each of the categories, our primary revenue sources are our property taxes as well as our other local taxes, which is earned income tax and our realty transfer tax. So looking at those two first, our real property taxes are meeting expectations. We typically collect the bulk of our real estate tax revenue in the beginning of the year. Taxpayers get a 2% discount for paying early. So at the start of COVID, we had collected a large part of that revenue. So we're on track with that revenue source. It's our largest revenue source. And we have about $450,000 left to be collected. Typically, we'll collect that. We would have collected it by now, but Council had made the decision to provide some financial assistance to our taxpayers who may have been struggling due to COVID-19, and extended out our penalty period to November 1st. So that gives people a lot more opportunities to make payments on their taxes without being hit with a 10% fee. So I suspect, ultimately we'll collect that revenue. It just may be a little bit delayed, but at this point, we've collected the bulk of it, and $400,000 compared to $4.7 million is a good performance to date in that regard. Our other local taxes, like I said, that includes our realty transfer tax and our earned income tax. This category we would have expected to be most affected by COVID, with rising unemployment affecting earned income tax, as well as halting really the economy in terms of selling property taxes. But we've been fortunate to not see that here. It was kind of a surprise. In terms of our realty transfer tax, we had received some large property transfers right before COVID hit, and that solidified that account through June 30th. So we actually met expectations within the first 2 months of the year, which aided in the decreasing performance through COVID at this point. The earned income tax was a surprise as well. We are stable in that regard. Initially, we were low, but we got some large payments in June, which put us on track for earned income tax. And we really attribute that to the fact that the Borough has benefited from some really stable institutions, having the local governments, the county, the school districts, all those businesses, the Giant being here, they continue to operate along with the warehouses, and with them having employees, we've benefited from not being hit by that unemployment decrease as much as we would have expected. We reached out to the school district because I know they had been planning or budgeting for a major decrease, and they're seeing similar performance to prior year as well. So we've benefited in that regard, and that is our second highest revenue category. Going down through the rest, they're all smaller in terms of revenue, but they've all been hit pretty heavily by COVID-19. Our licenses and permits are below expectations. With Governor Wolf's orders delaying development, we haven't seen the permits that we've seen in prior years. We've seen about a $65,000 decrease in permits and licenses for building-related activities. So that was hit pretty substantially. Perhaps we'll see a turnaround in the second half of the year if people were waiting to jump on it, but we'll kind of have to see and go from there. Our fines and forfeitures, or forfeits, that is below expectations, though compared to 2019, we've collected approximately the same amount, but it's consistently been underperformed, and it should be noted that for the 2020 budget, we tried to reduce the amount of expectations from that by $62,000 to get it more on track, and we're still slightly below. So we'll keep monitoring that and look at 2021 to see what we need to do to get that to be a more reasonable figure estimated. Our interest in rents, that includes both the rental of the community center, our LaTorte Park Pavilion, as well as just general interest on our accounts. We've obviously seen decreases because we closed the community center and our parks, so the revenue generated from those sources has been down. And then interest, really that is just related to the amount of cash we have on hand and how much interest we generate. And in 2019, we had a lot more cash on hand, and as we completed projects, that decreased and the associated interest decreased. Intergovernmental revenue, I'm saying we're right on track. We've only collected 1% of the revenue, but that's really made up of our state pension contribution that we receive, as well as our fire insurance contribution, and that typically comes in September, so we don't have a lot of revenue generated in that at this point in the year, typically. Our charges for services, that one has decreased about $113,000 and is one of our areas that were hardest hit by COVID. That includes the bulk of our parks and recreation revenue generated through the pool, as well as our recreation fees, and trying to do our best to follow CDC guidelines and Governor Wolf's orders. You'll see on the flip side that we've spent less and have done less in terms of services, thus collecting less revenue for that. And the expectation is we won't recover that revenue because there's just not the resources to do everything at once in the second half of the year. Okay, moving on to our other revenue. That category is hit or miss. That's kind of a catch-all related to insurances that we may get, and typically all of the revenue sources that are in that category are offset by some sort of expense. So, for instance, if the borough, somebody were to hit a telephone pole or a light pole, the borough would replace that, submit it for insurance, and we'd get reimbursed, and so it'd just be an offsetting sort of expenditure there. So overall, the general fund revenue, the larger revenue sources that we have are on track, and some of the lower, less counted on revenues are being hit, but they're certainly being hit related to COVID-19. So I'll move on to our next fund, which is our Capital Projects Fund. This fund in particular is a reimbursement fund where the borough will complete projects through our fund balance that we have in that fund or through line of credits, and then ultimately it'll get reimbursed from grants, or if the general fund had allocated funding for it, it'll just utilize fund balance. So we don't typically expect a lot of revenue generation in that account, though our intergovernmental revenues are lower than expectation, and the bulk of that is related to our TIF district. We're just kind of getting into receiving some of the grant funding that we had anticipated, so we'll see a lot more revenue coming into that account as we complete our Tiger project. But the borough is still vigorously, trying to get additional grant funding to help reduce any use of line of credit that we may need to use in the future if unsuccessful. The next section is our enterprise fund revenues. These are all user fee generated, so there's not a whole lot of services that we count on in these funds. But looking at them, the charges for services, our water fund has seen less revenue overall related to the amount of water that's been used. I've attributed about $81,000 to a decrease in water usage. That may be due to schools closing and just overall businesses using less water. And then the other revenue category for our water fund relates to our tapping fees, and that's directly related to development and how many people are tapping into our system. That revenue was about $83,000 last year at this point in the year, and in 2020 we're about $4,000. So we've seen some significant decreases in regards to our tapping fee. Our sewer fund charges for services has decreased. The primary reason for that is we receive a contribution from our surrounding townships for their use of our facility, and basically that is budgeted based on previous year's activities. So in 2019, it was based on the previous years before that, and we had charged our townships a larger amount of money. And then at the end of the year, we'll go back and reconcile true usage and adjust the next year based on that. So 2019, we had estimated that they would spend more or use more of our system than they did. And 2020, we're not recording any revenue in the first 2 quarters because it's balancing out the fact that that was not the case. So that'll be adjusting, and we'll see some increases later in the year once their credits have been fully utilized. Our stormwater fund is in good shape. Nothing really to report there. It's meeting all expectations at this point. We haven't really dove into what we had planned to on all of our capital projects in that. So right now the revenue we're generating is being stored for future use. Our solid waste fund is in good shape. I do have a tick mark there saying, that we need to watch it. But what happened there is we had planned ahead with the expectation that our manufacturer may have a shortage in resources, and we wanted to make sure that we had enough trash bags in the event that they closed or didn't have the staffing. So we bought more trash bags than we typically would buy at this point to cover us through what we estimated to be the time period at most risk. So we spent more money up front. We'll spend less money later, and we just haven't hit the revenue that we anticipated from those sales because we haven't sold the bags at this point. Our parking fund, I have that as a concern simply because it's not generating or wasn't generating much revenue. We had issued a moratorium on parking meters and leases, so at this point in the year we had lost about $140,000. The good news is that council and has been responsible with their budgeting, and all of these funds are stable. They have healthy reserves. So as we go through the year, we're able to count on those reserves to get us through. And we'll have to continue to evaluate that in future budgets because, as we go along, that will obviously deplete. So we'll keep watching that, but at this point, we're in pretty good shape revenue-wise. The next section in this report, I go through and identify the remaining budget balances of each department and each fund. The good news is, from a budgetary perspective, that there are no concerns. Some of the areas don't follow the straight line method, so I've identified those, one being the solid waste fund where we bought the additional bags up front, as well as some of the insurances in the administration account. We prepay insurance several months ahead, so it appears like we're spending money faster than we are. But in comparison to 2019, all of our departments are within expectations. Now, the downside to that, obviously, is when we looked at the revenues for the charges for services, that just means we're not offering, we're not able to perform these services that we had planned to, and as such, we've been saving money. Budget managers have been cautious and, you know, smart about their spending. As we've lost employees, we've also made the decision to delay hiring or not fill a position at this point until we see the outcome. So all of these factors play into the fact that we haven't spent as much as we expected, but from a budgetary perspective, it helps us maintain a solid fund balance and remain stable.